In Chapter 5, we will talk about the cost-volume-profit relationships, CVP. We will use different ways to analyze CVP relationships. Learning Objective 1 is to explain how changes in activity affect the contribution margin and net operating income. In Chapter 1, we've talked about the contribution income statement. It's different from traditional format. We organize expenses by cost behavior. The contribution income statement is useful for managers to judge the impact on profits or changes in selling price, cost, or volume. Let's take a look at an example of recent bicycle company's contribution income statement. We start from sales minus variable expenses. The difference is contribution margin. Minus fixed expenses, and we can get net operating income. Here, the contribution margin is the difference between sales and variable expenses. That's a capacity to cover fixed costs from operating the firm. Any remaining contribution margin goes to net operating income. We can also calculate contribution margin per unit. Let's take a look at here. The column per unit. Selling price per unit 500 minus variable expenses per unit. And $200 is unit contribution margin, which means if RBC Racing Bicycle Company sells one additional bicycle, $200 additional contribution margin will be generated to cover fixed expenses. For fixed expenses here, it's $80,000. If contribution margin is same as fixed expenses, then net operating income will be 0. That's the level at break-even point, which means if RBC generate $80,000 in total contribution margin, RBC can get break-even. So again, break-even is the level of sales at which profit is 0. If we want to take a look at how many units should be sold by RBC to get a break-even point, from the income statement here, we can see if RBC sells 400 bicycles, then total sales $200,000 minus variable expenses 300 per unit multiplied by 400, you will get $120,000. And the contribution margin, $80,000, fixed expenses $80,000, so net operating income 0. And if you take a look at here, we can use per unit or contribution margin per unit to calculate how many bicycles should be sold to get break-even point. Unit contribution margin $200. So here we use 80,000 divided by 200. You will get 400 bicycles. And to verify total sales, variable expenses, those are calculations. If RBC sells one more bicycle, now bicycles sold units 401. Net operating income will increase by $200. We can see the calculation based on contribution income statement. So 401 bicycles multiplied by $500 selling price per unit minus variable expenses 401 multiplied by 300, and you can get a contribution margin total $80,200. and minus fixed expenses 80,000. Net operating income 200. This is the same as unit contribution margin. Okay, moving on. Let's take a look at CVP relations in equation form. If we use equation to express the contribution format income statement, we can write the equation here. Profit, this is same as here, net operating income on the contribution income statement. Profit equals sales minus variable expenses minus fixed expenses. And we know sales minus variable expenses is contribution margin. So that's the equation form. If we put numbers here, RBC sells 401 units. We can calculate sales equal 401 units multiplied by $500. This is selling price per unit. And for variable expenses, 401 times 300. $300, this is variable expense per unit. Minus fixed expenses, 80,000. And we can get $200 profit. This is consistent with what we've calculated on the contribution income statement. 200 here, same. If a company has only one single product, we can refine the equation per unit basis. See here, if we rewrite total sales as quantity sold, we use Q to indicate the quantity sold. That's unit sold. Multiplied by selling price per unit, indicated by P. Total sales, Q multiplied by P. For variable expenses, same. We can use quantity sold, Q, multiplied by variable expenses per unit. We use V to indicate it. And you can get variable expenses, Q times V. So we rewrite this equation as P times Q minus V times Q minus fixed expenses. And we can replace it by numbers. So we have 500, this is P, times the 401, Q, this is the quantity sold, minus V, $300, times the 401, and minus 80,000, fixed expenses. We can get 200, same. Well, it's also useful to express a simple profit equation in terms of a unit contribution margin. Recall that unit contribution margin is the difference between selling price per unit, P, minus variable expenses per unit, V. So we can rewrite the equation here. Based on the original equation here, on per unit basis, we can rewrite profit as P minus V multiplied by Q minus fixed expenses. And P minus V is unit contribution margin. So the equation here can be expressed as profit equals unit contribution margin times Q minus fixed expenses. Let's put numbers here. Unit contribution margin, $200. So we use $200 times Q, quantity sold, minus fixed expenses, and we can get $200 profit. From this equation here, we can tell profit is positively related to quantity sold, which means if quantity increases by 1 unit, profit will increase by a unit of contribution margin. Learning objective 2 is to prepare an interpretive cost volume profit graph and a profit graph. the relationships among revenue, cost, profit, and volume can be expressed graphically by preparing a CVP graph. And we will use Racing Bicycle Company as an example to develop our graph. So here, this is contribution margin income statement for RBC at 0, 200, 400, and 600 units sold level. We can calculate net operating income based on contribution margin income statement. So we have total sales minus total variable expenses, and then we can get a contribution margin. And minus fixed expenses, and we can get net operating income respectively for different levels of our units sold. And of course, we can use a shortcut to calculate the net operating income. For example, if RBC has sold 200 units, we can use 200 units multiplied by unit contribution margin, which is $200, minus fixed expenses, and we can get net operating loss, because this is negative 40,000. And for units 600 sold, we use 600 units multiplied by 200 contribution margin per unit, minus fixed expenses 80,000, and we can get positive 40,000. So based on contribution margin income statements at different units level sold, we can develop CVP graph. In a CVP graph, unit volume is represented on the x-axis. This is a horizontal level. And dollars on the y-axis. This is a vertical level. We will follow steps to prepare a CVP graph. Step 1, draw a line parallel to the volume axis to represent total fixed expenses. It's here, 80,000. Step 2, choose some sales volume, say 400 units, and plot the point representing total expenses, including both fixed and variable. Draw a line through the data point back to where the fixed expenses line intercepts the dollar axis. Here, that's a blue line. And for total expenses, it's fixed part 80,000 plus variable part 400 units multiplied by 300. $300 is the variable expense per unit. Step 3, we choose some sales volume still for 400 units and plot the point representing total sales. We draw the line through the data point back to the point of orange. So this is green line, total sales. Selling price per unit, $500, multiplied by 400 units sold, and total sales here, 200,000. Here, at 400 units sold level, this is our break-even point. Net operating income will be 0. Here, for right-hand side, green line, this is total sales. Blue line, this is total expenses. Total sales are more than total expenses. So this is profit area. For left-hand side here, total expenses are more than total sales. This is loss area. Well, sometimes we can just use a simpler form of CVP graph, which is profit graph. So we only draw the line for profit. Based on the equation here, profit equals unit CM multiplied by Q. Keep in mind Q is a quantity sold, minus fixed costs. And we can draw the line for profit. We can choose two numbers here, 300 units sold and 500 units sold, and draw the line here. That's a profit graph. And at this point here, 400 units sold, this is break-even point because profit equals 0. Learning objective 3. We will use the contribution margin ratio, which is CM ratio, to calculate the changes in contribution margin and net operating income resulting from changes in sales volume. For contribution margin ratio, the ratio is calculated by dividing the total contribution margin by total sales. So we take a look at here the total column. We have contribution margin total 100,000 and total sales 250,000. 100,000 divided by 250,000, we will get percentage 40%. This is contribution margin ratio. And we can also calculate by unit basis. Let's take a look at here. We know CM ratio equals total contribution margin divided by total sales. And if we rewrite this, we can get a CM per unit multiplied by Q. This is the quantity. And divided by selling price per unit multiplied by Q. So we cancel out the Q from numerator and denominator, and then we can get a CM ratio equals contribution margin per unit divided by selling price per unit. In our example RBC, unit contribution margin is $200 and selling price per unit $500. So we can still get CM ratio 40%. Basically, there are two ways to calculate the CM ratio. We can either use total contribution margin divided by total sales, or we can use unit contribution margin divided by selling price per unit. In addition to CM ratio, we can also calculate the variable expense ratio. For variable expense ratio, that's a ratio of variable expenses to sales. We can either calculate it by dividing the total variable expenses by the total sales. In the example here, 150,000 divided by 250,000, and then we can get 60%. This is variable expense ratio. Or we can calculate it based on per unit. So we can use variable expense per unit divided by unit selling price. $300 divided by $500. Here I get 60% as well. Those are two equations we've learned. And now we can rewrite it in contribution margin ratio format. Profit equals contribution margin ratio times sales minus fixed expenses. How can we get it? Here, this is a proof. From second equation, profit equals contribution margin minus fixed expenses. And for the variable here, CM, we can rewrite it as CM divided by sales multiplied by sales, right? Those two cancel out. So we just rewrite the format here. And then contribution margin, CM, divided by sales is contribution margin ratio. So that's how we can get equation 3 here from equation 2. Let's take a look at numbers. If Racing Bicycle reported sales of 250,000, what would the management expect profit or net operating income to be? We want to calculate using the CM ratio. So we have profit equals 40%. This is contribution margin ratio multiplied by sales. This is the total sales, 250,000 minus 80,000. And we can get the same number, 20,000.